Mr. Archimedes Bath, a story by Pamela Allen, integrated with Grade 2 NGSS Science Standards. Let's hear the story of Mr. Archimedes Bath. Mr. Archimedes' bath always overflowed. And Mr. Archimedes always had to clean up the mess. Can anyone tell me where all this water came from? Mr. Archimedes decided to find out. He put just a little water in the bath as he always did, and this time he measured the depth. But the water rose. Where did all this water come from? Bellowed Mr. Archimedes. Let's answer his question. But first, let's look at the NGSS standards for Grade 2, Structure and Properties of Matter. PS1-1 for Grade 2 is plan and conduct an investigation to describe and classify different kinds of materials by their observable properties. Let's look at the disciplinary core ideas related to this. PS1A. Different kinds of matter exist, and many of them can be either solid or liquid depending on temperature. Matter can be described and classified by its observable properties, and different properties are suited to different purposes. Now let's look at science and engineering practices, but start at the bottom. Scientists search for cause and effect relationships to explain natural events. Make observations to construct an evidence-based account of natural phenomenon. Analyze data from tests of an object or tool to determine if it works as intended. Construct an argument with evidence to support a claim. And finally, plan and conduct an investigation collaboratively to produce data to serve as the basis for evidence to answer a question. So once students have gone through this process, they will be able to answer Mr. Archimedes' question, where did all this water come from? Finally, cross-cutting concepts. Patterns in the natural and human-designed world can be observed. Events have causes that generate observable patterns. And finally, simple tests can be designed to gather evidence to support or refute students' ideas about causes. Finally, Common Core State Standards connections. R1.2.1 and R1.2.3 ask and answer such questions as who, what, where, when, why, and how to demonstrate understanding of key details in a text, and describe the connection between a scientific idea or concept and the text. Finally, the math standards reason abstractly and quantitatively, model with mathematics, use appropriate tools strategically, and draw a picture graph and a bar graph to represent a data set with up to 4 categories. So here are the materials for the experiment of Mr. Archimedes' bath. A jar filled to the top with water and a couple of receptacles and a potato that represents Mr. Archimedes. Mr. Archimedes is a solid and the water is a liquid, so their properties are different. Mr. Archimedes will push the water out of the container because as a liquid, the water just fills up the container. So here we go. The amount of water Mr. Archimedes will push out is the amount of space Mr. Archimedes takes up. Let's measure how much water Mr. Archimedes pushed out or displaced from his bath. We're just going to pour the water that spilled out right into the cup, and as you can see, it equals about 100 milliliters. So that's the space Mr. Archimedes takes up. So now let's do a comparison with Mr. Archimedes and a bigger potato that we'll call Mr. Kangaroo. Now is a good time to have the students predict what should happen when they see the two different sized potatoes. We know that Mr. Archimedes took 100 milliliters of water and pushed it out of the bath. I wonder how much water Mr. Kangaroo, the bigger potato, will push out of the bath. So we'll do exactly the same procedure, keeping everything the same. We'll drop Mr. Kangaroo into the bath and we'll see what happens. It looked like Mr. Kangaroo pushed out a lot more water, but let's measure or quantify how much water Mr. Kangaroo pushed out of the bath. And it is about 200 milliliters. So now let's present the data, maybe as the students would. Mr. Archimedes pushed out or displaced 100 milliliters of water from the bath. Mr. Kangaroo pushed out 200 milliliters of water from the bath. Now, let's make an axis of X on the horizontal and Y on the vertical. And on the horizontal, we will label it Mr. Archimedes and Mr. Kangaroo. And on the y-axis, we will label it the amount of water displaced from the bath. So now we'll use Post-it notes that represent 100 milliliters to make a bar graph for Mr. Archimedes and Mr. Kangaroo. So let's place one Post-it note worth 100 milliliters above Mr. Archimedes' label because he displaced 100 milliliters of water. And now let's place two 100 milliliter Post-it notes, each equaling 100 milliliters, to represent Mr. Kangaroo's 200 milliliters that he displaced from the bath. And now students can design their own experiment with Mr. Archimedes and his friends. Mr. Archimedes Bath can be found read in its entirety on YouTube. It can be purchased. And for any questions, comments, or suggestions, please contact me at STEAMWorksjk@gmail.com. Thank you.